You goddamn kids, you think you've got it made.
Who, me?
Who do you think you are, anyway?
Ow, no!
I seen you on TV,
Wait, no, I mean, ow!
always
What do you...
doing the soul
What do you...
hammer.
No, it wasn't me, I swear! Ow, that hurts! Ow, I'm sorry, I didn't...
Well,
Wait a minute.
you ain't
Hey, what's going on? Mister, what's up? Hey, let go of me!
I'm sorry.
It's gonna be like me!
I want
mine!
mommy.
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Good Art, the podcast. This is your host, K. Gerard. Today we got a big episode. Mr. Geza X from the Los Angeles punk scene in the 70s and 80s has a laundry list of punk credentials behind him, producing albums for the Dead Kennedys, the Germs, Black Flags, the Weirdos, sort of considered to be the producer from the West Coast scene back then. But I decided to not talk about that very much at all and wanted to focus on his 1982 record, You Goddamn Kids. It's the only full album that he wrote, produced, and put out. Geza X and the Mommy Men. I fell in love with this album quite a while ago and really wanted to get to know more about it. It's such a unique and strange and interesting take on punk. So here it is, my interview with Geza X. Enjoy. Maybe we can open it up with this. How is it different when you're recording and writing and producing a record than just being given, like, tapes or, something else, somebody else's stuff to work on and polish?
Recording my own stuff, as with many artists, is kind of difficult and painful, like pulling teeth. The process never comes that easily for me, so I kind of abandoned it. I like playing in bands like the Deadbeats and the Bags, and that was more fun because then I was more like the guitar player and collaborator. But when I had to do everything myself, like I did with the Mommy Men, it was overwhelming. And I have an anxiety disorder, so I didn't know all of this back in those days. I just took drugs and drank, to try and solve that. But I just found it really overwhelming. That's why there's only one album. I've recorded a whole lot of other tracks and never really finished them or released them because, frankly, I just couldn't deal. When I'm producing other bands, the path is very clear to me. Are you going to play this back or are you going to transcribe it? Because I'm eating food and I don't want to be rude.
I was going to just play it as, on my, I have a podcast that I put out. But honestly, that's up to you. If you want, if you want to eat, feel free.
Okay, feel free. I mean, I it's okay with me too. I don't mind if people hear me chomping. But what I discovered was when I was producing stuff, I have, my dad was he was it's like the cliche, but he was a rocket scientist and he did a lot of math for the, the Pioneer probe and Voyager and all this stuff. He did a lot of the orbits. So I grew up surrounded by science. And I expressed an interest in electronics, especially like turning knobs and stuff like that, very early age. So inevitably, I kind of ended up getting into audio where there's a lot of knobs to turn. And I found it, fairly easy to learn that and absorb it. It's, and it is, even nowadays, although there's a shit ton of people doing digital recording, it is rocket science. It's a very complex world with a lot of variables. And you need to know your computer, you need to know your workstation, you need to know a certain amount of audio stuff, you need to know a certain amount of music stuff. So that stuff, the education part of it, I absorbed it pretty quick. And so when I got the opportunity to work with other bands, I jumped at it because I wanted to be a producer, I wanted to be an engineer, and that was sort of my backup plan if rock stardom kind of failed, which I mean, it sort of did. I like music and I like playing it, but I don't really put my all into it as I do with the production. So bands started asking me to help them. The Germs were the first. Darby came up to me one day at the Mask, which was Hollywood's like infamous punk rock epicenter, MASQUE, and that was like a club that was like more like a DIY bootleg sort of venue than anything else. Very illegal. And I used to live there. I used to sleep on the floor and do the PA and everything like that. So I was always at the shows, and Darby came to one of the shows and just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You a producer? Produce the Germs." And that was how it all began. So when I work with other bands, I found it to be very enjoyable because I mean, frankly, all I have to do is boss them around and use whatever musical and technical knowledge that I had. And I loved working with really difficult artists. Not so much anymore. I think I kind of burned out on that. But back in the day, it was really exciting to work with people as crazy as myself. And so I got a lot of pleasure out of being able to take their music and just make it sound a little bit better. I had some idea of what production was, which no one else really in the neighborhood did in those days. There were a few people that knew how to record stuff, but producing was a little bit more sophisticated, where you would, actually try and craft the sounds so they translated well to, in those days, the medium of tape. And we were working in the cheapest, shittiest recording studios. These were like $5 an hour kind of operations, so we were lucky if we had 8 tracks to work with. So, we had to make the best of it. A lot of times the label, the first one was Slash. They gave us like something like 5 hours to record 3 Germ songs at $5 an hour.
Wow.
Budgets were small. So, we were banging it out really fast. And that was the Lexicon Devil single, which I think still has a charming sound. Both Pat Smear and I forgot to bring an amplifier, so I had to run the guitars direct through all my pedals that I brought along. So that crazy sound is my pedals with Pat Smear playing. And I like it, but I've gotten some criticism over the years for it, but I don't care. I think it's a great little record. That got me started, and after that I did the Bags, the Deadbeats, and the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag in pretty quick order after that. So that put me on the map, and I discovered that I had a knack for this, and I was able to continue getting work for a long time after that. And it was a little different. It's still very difficult and painful because now it's other people's dreams that are on the line. Everyone comes into the studio and they're going to be the next big thing. And it's kind of up to me to attempt to support that as best I can. And, a lot of these acts were very raggedy when we first started recording them. I worked with better acts over the years, but I mean, better is a relative term too, because there's not much that can replace that, just compelling power and urgency of the early punkers.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of is the answer to that particular question.
Okay.
I'm going to take a bite.
All right. What are you eating?
Oh, toast with an egg made with mushrooms and spinach and scallions. It's just delicious.
That's pretty similar to what I ate a little bit ago. I usually
Mm.
don't eat very much bread, but not that I have like gluten intolerance, but I usually just don't eat a lot of bread.
Actually, coincidentally, this is gluten-free bread because I was having problems with dairy and gluten. So that really helped me out once I started to switch that around.
Yeah. Where'd you get the mommy men from? That name? Is there a specific thing?
Good question. That's just got to be some deep-seated neurosis on my part. I was trying to, you know, that was an oddball situation because, I played in the Deadbeats for a while, which were very much like Dada punk, and I love that band, the Deadbeats. To this day, I just love the Deadbeats. Brilliant stuff. Um, they had everything that I liked, which was sort of a little dash of Frank Zappa, sort of a Dada kind of twist. But they were a little on the light side when I joined them, and I added that Marshall stack and the heavy X chords I call them, which is just like a stacked flat fives. They've become very popular over the years since then, but back then it was still kind of a new sound, very dissonant, very big. It's like just like a truck falling off a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
And on the Deadbeats, I added a octave splitter to Pat Delaney's saxophone, and then he and I would work out parts where basically he was playing rhythm sax. So he was like the other guitarist in the band. So I would play, and I put him through a big amplifier with a pickup and everything. So it wasn't the usual sax playing through the microphone and sounding all thin. It was like really fat. And he and I would get these like power chords going where I would be playing the same parts, and because he had an octave divider, it would sound like sort of like the root note of a chord. So when he and I would get going, we would like just have this thunderous sound, and the Deadbeats became like what you could only call a hard punk rock Dada band with similar to my own taste, like a certain amount of Frank Zappa influence, with the kind of the doo wop and everything, and then the dissonant sort of things. And the Deadbeats did something that I didn't do, which was there was a lot of different sections to the songs, and the songs would just like start slow and go fast and just be really crazy, like fascinating arrangements. So when I decided to start my own band, it was sort of like that. I sort of you know, took about half of that concept, which was very similar to what I was into anyways, the hard guitar part of it. But I was really interested in kind of branching off from punk rock in those days, and I wanted this to be also kind of a new wave thing. So the Mommy Man, I thought it was going to be commercial because I was listening to not just punk rock, but bands like the Knack and stuff. And I tried to merge all the different things that I love, that really the Dada art sensibility with the costumes and the weirdness and all of that, with the sort of like the musical cubism of Captain Beefheart, who was one of my absolute favorite bands. Of course, it makes sense. And the sort of new wave bounciness of something like the Knack, and then the sort of twisted neurotic role playing that I sort of introduced in the Deadbeats, because I used to do a little routine about Mean Mr. Mommy Man in the Deadbeats, and then I just carried that over to uh, you know the band, the Geza X and the Mommy Men, and then I developed that whole thing into that Mean Mr. Mommy Man routine, and so of course it made sense to call the band the Mommy Men.
With the songs, it seems like I have like written down here. It seems like some of the songs have more of a story background to them, and in particular, like I'm not a Hungarian, and like we need more power. The paranoids are coming. Those those ones, and maybe I hate punks, but I feel like that one's probably just mostly tongue in cheek. Those those 3-4 tracks seem like I guess more personal, or like they're sort of like a journal entry or diary entry more than just a song. Like they're telling a story about you.
Well, I grew up in the '60s, and I was kind of like even at the age of like 14, I started to turn into a hippie, and I grew up in the '60s protest scene and spent quite a bit of time in it. I went to Berkeley and I was part of the People's Park riots, which are probably forgotten by these days. But, I saw all the great speakers like Angela Davis and Stokely Carmichael. I heard the MC5 play on a flatbed truck at People's Park in Berkeley. I went and saw the Jefferson Airplane and all of that kind of stuff. So I went to all of the, you know, uh, sit-ins, and in fact, I would ditch high school to go to UCLA and print flyers for all of their, sit-ins and strikes when all the students were striking against the war in Vietnam. So I was very politically active, and over later years, in the early '70s, there wasn't much of that left. So I ended up hitchhiking up and down the coast with my dog and my guitar, and trying to find musicians who could comprehend what it was that I wanted to do, which was to sort of make organized noise, like to use really dissonant chords, but really thumpy, tom heavy beats, and make some really bouncy music that was different from rock in the sense that it was a lot more primal, but it was also uh, you know different from Iggy, who was another one of my influences in the sense that the chords were a lot more dissonant. So I wanted to combine like sort of like blue cheer with sort of like jungle drums, not sort of like the neo EDM type jungle drums, but what we used to just call it jungle drums, which is the kind of pluppa 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 type of drums. Um, with a kind of a blue cheer type of sound. And Blue Cheer was another one of my favorite bands. Very early influence on a lot of punkers. Interestingly, is the same stuff I was into. Blue Cheer, Captain Beefheart, Iggy. Those were the three things that keep coming up when uh, I interview people. Don Bowles and I started to work on a movie about the early Hollywood days, and we're still working on it. Sadly, it's been 5 years. It's really hard to make a movie by yourself, but we have all of the interviews now, and I'm learning how to edit in Adobe Premiere. But anyways, I digress. So I was trying to find people that could understand what it was that I wanted to do. I called it X music, and I wanted to, way before X, it was a different kind of thing. It was more like the crossroads of two different styles. One would be like the sort of like bouncy tom-tommy drums, and the other would be like the dissonant chords. So I called that X music, and I did find a lot of people as I traveled, and many of them came to Los Angeles later. Joe Nannini, who became the drummer of Wall of Voodoo, he came along. Uh, that was in the early days. We met a lot of people locally here in LA, and did a lot of proto-punk stuff with people like Charlotte Caffey, Tito Lariva, Joe Nannini, who all ended up becoming like, well-known persons in the scene. So eventually I landed back here in LA, and tried to introduce this idea I was doing. And it took many years really for it to kind of take root. But that's sort of like a little bit of the actual history behind the Mommy Men sound.
So, you have like a pretty large list of band members on the album. Was that because you was there a particular reason why, or was it just sort of more happenstance?
Yeah, yeah, no, it was very, very carefully conceived, actually. First off, I was best friends with Brendan Mullen, who was the person who, rented the place that became the Mask. So he ran the Mask, which was this cavernous kind of like underground cellar with many rooms, and it was mostly rehearsal rooms. But eventually, we started running shows. I had some PA gear and some recording gear, so I became the sound man. I ended up renting a little room from him there in the Mask, and we all lived there. He, Bruce Moreland, this cat named Spaz Attack, and myself, we were the ones that lived there. Also, this band called the Controllers, they all lived in a room there. So the Mask was kind of like, where the scene coalesced, and a lot of musicians came through there to rehearse. So I ended up, because of that and the production stuff and playing in bands, I ended up meeting everyone in the scene. And Brendan is just this like magical, poetic person. Really lots of culture and very, very good roots. He also loved Dada, so he and I were always talking about the Mask being sort of a Dada cabaret. And he loved the Deadbeats because he was one of the few people back then who got that band. And so when I started the Mommy Men, he was a drummer. He was a jazz drummer, and frankly, he wasn't the world's best drummer. He, was a little choppy on like his timing and a little uneven on his beats. But I wanted him to be in the band so bad because he was like my best friend, and because he was that poetic character that had created the Mask, which was our little hellhole for the community, right? So so it started with him and me, and I brought in different persons along the way, and some people dropped in and some people dropped out. But Pat Delaney, I uh, I got him from the Deadbeats, and he played in both bands as well as the Bee People, which was another good experimental kind of band back in the day. And then I got actually had a number of bass players, but around the time of the album, there were these two producers named Bobby and Larson Payne who have regrettably been lost in the sands of time. But those guys, and back in the early days, they managed and recorded like everyone. I was their engineer for a while. They had rented a little studio in the Hollywood Hills, teeny little place, um, and they were doing demos with like the Go Go's, Fear, Josie Cotton, um, uh, I mean, a dozen other people, but those were the names that stood out. And because I was their engineer, they just let me have the run of the studio. So I had a studio to work out of, and Bobby Payne became the bass player in the Mommy Men for a good long stretch. He did all of our shows in L.A. and in San Francisco, and uh, you know, he's dead now, but his brother Larson's still alive, and those guys need to get their due because they pretty much created and built the Go-Go's in the early days, and a lot of people don't know that. They were instrumental also in getting, Fear the really, really best demo, in the early days too. So, they helped me a lot with my early band, and in fact, Larson helped produce the vocals because it's really hard to do vocals and record at the same time. It splits your focus.
Yeah.
So, and then some other people who were in the band. Paul Rossler was like one of my best friends. I actually helped him get into the Screamers when the Screamers needed a keyboard player. I begged them to try him out, and they didn't want to do it because he was so young. And I said, this cat is like gonna be the whiz kid of all time because he was classically trained and really a sweet guy. So Paul Rossler ended up playing bass, and then later on, I mean, excuse me, keyboards, and then later on, Kira, his sister, was coming of age, and I started dating her, and before too long, she ended up playing bass in the band, replaced Bobby Payne. So Kira Rossler was in the later Mommy Man. Paul Rossler was in the whole thing. Pat Delaney was in the whole thing. And then the miracle was that I wanted a marimba player because I had seen Captain Beefheart band with marimbas and always loved that sound. And that kind of fit my one of my influences, strong hardcore influences, is really cartoons. I watched just a shit ton of cartoons when I was a kid, and they were like the old style cartoons. So I probably have that in common with Oingo Boingo, that
Sure, sure.
the cartoon influence with the marimbas, and Captain Beefheart cartoon influence with the marimbas. Um, so I wanted a cartoony marimba player, and I turned out that Don Bonebreak, who was X's drummer, played marimbas. So once we got him in the band, my dream setup, which was like slightly orchestral with a sax and marimbas, quite frankly, some of it was quite derivative of Captain Beefheart because he was like one of my favorite artists. I'd grown up with Frank Zappa, and then later on Captain Beefheart. When I heard his bands, I just really liked the thing that mallets and horns could do for a band. Once you have one mallet player and one horn player, I mean, obviously I was a producer and an arranger, so I was aware of the fact that even with one horn and one set of mallets, you have a little mini orchestra. And even though I wasn't really very gifted at funk, we were all listening to a lot of James Brown and a lot of the sort of like the neo funk that was coming out of New York at the time with the contortions and stuff.
Hmm.
So there was a little bit of that in there too. But we were white kids and we weren't really very funky, as it turned out. I took one stab at it with that song "Funky Monsters," which thank God that what we were doing was like more cartoon and more, you know, weirdo music than trying to really be funky because it sounds pretty stiff, but as a goofy piece of music, it's very very nice.
Right, right, right. How long, like from when you were actually able to get the ball rolling with the Mommy Men, how long was it an actual group?
It was together for several years. It went through various incarnations because not all the players were available at once. Most of them were sort of like borrowed from other bands.
Hmm.
So if X was doing shows, one of two things would happen: is they would let me open, which was wonderful, or so Don could play in both.
Hmm.
Or I would have to like not have certain instruments. And what ended up happening sometimes was kind of a la Zappa. I would um, fill the slots occasionally with other instrumentalists, and there were many. There was some very illustrious players, like even Flea came in and played trumpet once, and I can't really remember offhand, but uh, I had a really I wish I might have to send you the information afterward, but I had a lot of good players who would sit in on this. It was kind of one of those things where, even though I wasn't the world's best guitarist, kind of my other abilities, I guess I outshone that. And people who were good musicians would love to play in my band because I discovered that some of these guys, it's like they know their main instrument, but a lot of times they have another instrument, and they really, really would like to play that. Like Flea plays trumpet tremendously well, and how often does he get a chance? Not that often. So I found that by giving people an opportunity to play these alternate instruments, I could get some very good players to
Hmm.
sit in on shows, and that that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I would say 3 4 years, through different phases. The core band with all of the instruments from the album was about 2 years, with only really one uh, change, and that was from Bobby Payne to Kira Rossler on bass. And then after that, I experimented with a 3 piece and sometimes with like, different lineups. And I even tried a couple of like all improvisational things that, by the way, didn't go that well and got me booted out of the whiskey one time.
What was up with the like your little like headset? Like
Well, I just wanted to be free to roam the stage and like act like a maniac because I am sort of manic depressive and I got these like, kind of spurts of like, manic energy where so I would rework all my guitars. I built a little tiny guitar that was just, I'm so sad that I lost that when I was roadieing for the Screamers and, you know, they were playing a gig with Robert Fripp at Haraz, and unfortunately KK parked the truck with all my gear in front of the projects. He didn't know any better, and it got broken into, and this guitar that I had spent years building got stolen.
oh geez, that's
So
shame.
yeah, but at any rate, I had a little tiny guitar. You can see that in some of the Deadbeats pictures. And then I built this headset. I took apart like a announcer's headset and sculpted it way down so that I got rid of the earpiece and all of that so that I could just sing. And then I would just take a mic cord and pop it into that and put that in my back pocket. And so I could wander around the stage, dragging a cord. In those days, there was no cordless
Right.
mics or guitars, but I could move all over the front of the stage and do my act. My wife says that whenever you see Britney Spears doing it, I say I invented that shit. I did. I got credit in Wikipedia for inventing that.
Oh, that's cool. Is there anything you really, really wish you could have got on that record? Like one thing when you hear the record, you you really you notice that is missing.
Yeah, I really wanted to recut RX Rock and Roll and do a better version of it, and we did do the basic track, but I never really finished it up. RX Rock and Roll got released as a single, but I did
Yeah.
the single myself. After the mask became problematic, Brendan and I moved to right across the alley there into this place called the Cy Amber building. And Cy Amber had a clothing store downstairs, but he had a bunch of pretty much vacant offices upstairs. And some of these were pretty nice. Like my office was plush. So I rented an office space there. Brendan had his office there, and directly next to me, Wall of Voodoo had rented office space too. So I started recording my first single on a 4-track docorder, and Wall of Voodoo had a 4-track docorder too, and they started working on Ring of Fire. I could hear it through the wall as I was recording RX Rock and Roll and Pony Ride. So it was an amazing moment. Um, uh, I did record it, but I did all the instruments myself, sort of in the style that Renee Dalder had done with the Screamers, where you record like a whole snare beat all the way through,
Mm.
and then you add all the other stuff. And on a 4-track, you have to keep spilling the tracks back and forth from one channel to another, so they get kind of murky. But I was a good enough tech that I was able to kind of get it to sound okay. So I liked the innocent charm of those first two. I did release that on vinyl as RX Rock and Roll and Pony Ride, but I always wanted to recut RX Rock and Roll with like a better sound. That was a really good song, and I don't think it ever really got what it deserved.
And Final Gear Records, that's just you, right?
Well, Final Gear Records, a long time back when I was hitchhiking up and down the coast, I connected with a cat named Kim Comet, Komet, and I put an ad in Rolling Stone magazine actually that said, "Shitty lead guitarist seeks uncoordinated macrobiotic Martian mutants who play rotten music." And this was in 1970 or so, 72. And Kim Comet, who lived in Ben Lomond, California, which is like, Hobbit land up north of Santa Cruz, with like ferns and really dense forest. He answered it, and he was like so excited. He was the only person who made sense. I mean, all the other people who answered it were like, "I want to play tasty jazz licks," and I was like, "Stop." I want to play it because I wanted to play X music. I wanted brutal, loud, and he was into all the same stuff I was into. Captain Beefheart, Iggy. He didn't like the psychedelic '60s as much as I did, but he brought a lot of other stuff my way, because he was a Iggy fanatic, and he loved the MC5 and all the. He was even more primal than I was, so that worked out really well. And we ended up starting a band called the Silver Chalice, and our mission was like this kind of, it was almost like neo-Christian, but we wanted to find all of the artifacts that Hitler had stolen during the war, that like the spear of destiny that pierced the side of Christ, and the holy goblet from like the Templars, and all of this kind of stuff. And we thought that if we did that, we could take over the world with rock and roll. It's amazing to think back at how delusional I was in those days, but I was a maniac and still sort of am. I had high dreams and ideals and everything. So the Silver Chalice continued through those days. It was like sort of my dirty little secret of like sort of like a hard rock, early metal kind of band. Very good songs. The Silver Chalice has a couple of things that you can find on YouTube. Really, really stand the test of time, But it was not to be, because punk rock sort of intervened and took over. Kim and I remained friends throughout the punk rock period, and we ended up reviving the Silver Chalice with Don Bonebreak played drums on some stuff. Don Bowles played drums on a whole EP with us, along with Rob Graves, who's sadly now dead, but Rob Graves was in 45 Grave with Don.
Yeah.
And Rob was one of the best bass players I've ever heard. He was just a delightful human being, and unfortunately a junkie who ended up dying in New York, but it happens.
Right.
I'm trying to remember. Lee Joseph, he has two labels. I'm trying to remember both the names.
There was one on Burger Records.
I don't know anything about that one. What's that? Was it reissued as a cassette?
Yeah, I think it was a cassette in 2015.
Oh, okay. So that was done. Yeah, that was pretty recent. That was done by Authorized Records, and basically
Oh yeah,
Authorized
Yeah.
Authorized Records is run by a very nice cat named Jake, who's a close friend of mine, and that's how we met. Actually, he wanted to reissue that. What Jake does with Authorized is he does limited runs of things that didn't really get enough action.
Sure.
So he'll do like 500 cassettes or 500 vinyl, and that's a paradigm that a lot of smaller labels follow. I like it, because what they'll do is they'll do like a run of 500, and that's it. They'll usually give the band 25 or so, and maybe $500 to just do the whole thing, and then that's the end of it. And I like that a lot, because it gets a lot of things out into circulation that did not necessarily get seen that well.
Right.
Munster Records in France, they do that too, and they reissued the Silver Chalice single in the similar manner, just a limited pressing of 500.
Lovely. Hmm. What have you been working on lately?
Well, what I do for bread and butter income is I do disc mastering. People send me songs from all over the world, and I just they upload them to Dropbox, and then I download them and master them and send them back. That's been really really fun because I get my hands on so much emerging music, which is what I was in it always in the first place. That was always what I was in it for. Is I just love to be like the person that that hears it first before it's released.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what got me into engineering and production in the first place, is that I just love to hear new sounds. And as a result, I've managed to stay current. Like even though I'm an old cat, I've managed to stay current with like everything. When EDM was huge and Burning Man was huge, I was right in the center camps. Rigging up like rides and amusements and stuff. Because I just love to be like, in the middle of the action, kind of like before it's too late. Once it gets commercialized and everybody knows about it, I lose interest. So, definitely as a maniac, I'm also an early adopter. And I really love to be like, right where things are happening. So I found that disc mastering, I got so sick of living like a rat in a studio 24 hours a day. Studiosis is a real disease. It's like, even when I had my dream studio in Malibu and it was gorgeous and all these windows overlooking the ocean and the mountains, and I had built it to my own specifications and I got to run that for 13 years. But um, even with that, sort of like the second half of that, I'd never even hardly set foot in that studio. Paul Rossler came and he ended up moving in with us and became the engineer. I trained him on how to do everything, and he ended up doing all the sessions there because I just couldn't hack it anymore. I got so sick of the pressure of trying to like kind of bring someone else's dreams to life and all of the stress and emotionality of that. A very emotional person, and it's like I really love musicians, and it just got really difficult to deal with all of that. So um, I started disc mastering, and I've never really turned back. I get clients from all over the place, and I get to play work on records from Japan and you know Spain, and Italy, and Germany, and stuff like that. It's so fun, and I these are all things that are about to be released. Usually on a small kind of basis, but that's what I know and love. So it's turned out really really well for me. The result of doing that for a long time now, people have been starting to ask me to do mixes again, and even a couple of productions. And I pick the productions very carefully because I just I like I said, I just can't deal with the stress of being in the studio for like weeks at a time. But mixes, I like doing mixes. I found some new software that it's called Harrison Mixbus, and it has the most analog sound. Yeah, I gave them a shout out. They really deserve it. It's still a little glitchy and it has a few bugs and stuff, but it's going to take over from Pro Tools because it has like a compressor and EQ on every channel. All the routing options are just brilliant. It's really really good software. It's a pretty heavy CPU hit on the computer. It really takes a lot of juice to run it, but my God, the sound is just delicious. So when I started mixing on that, I started getting mixing gigs again. So I'm happy if your listeners know that I'm doing mixes on a up and coming new software that really sounds good.
Cool. Very cool. Well, I think we've reached the end of my little tale here. Is there anything you want to end on? Is there anything you want to?
Sure. I just want to reiterate that I've been working on this movie about the Hollywood scene. The hardcore scene really got some good movies about it. American hardcore, et cetera, et cetera. And and there was this sort of slash centric, decline of Western civilization. But unfortunately, it did not really reflect the true way that the Hollywood scene was formed and what it turned into. So the whole early era of like 72 from like Rodney's English Disco to 82, which is when like sort of the hardcore scene took off, except for a few little tidbits from the decline, which like I said was very skewed to one perspective. It's just never been told. That story's never been told. It's sad because New York and England and all those scenes have really, really gotten well documented. So basically, Don Bowles is the drummer from the Germs. Um, he has some incredible talents that people don't know about. He's a stunning DJ. He's a wonderful radio announcer. He is into experimental music like you wouldn't believe. He has most of his record collection, in fact, is either like bubblegum glam 45s or these like completely obscure weirdo records, of like Stockhausen and all of these, um, you know, uh, LPs that are very hard to get these days, of music, concrete, stuff like that. He knows way more about it than I do. And, I like that stuff, but he's just a master. So, um, I tapped him to be the co-host on this and to do all the announcing and all the interviewing. And so we interviewed like about 40 people from the early scene. We have literally everybody, including journalists, photographers, band members, audience members. It's really, really great what we collected. And over the past 5 years, like I said, I've gone through three editors who sort of like dropped in and bailed. But luckily, I learned quite a bit from each one of them. So now I'm learning how to use Adobe Premiere, and I'm just going to edit it myself with my wife, Larva. And she's really brilliant too. She's got like a really good research chops and art sensibility. She went to art school. She's a model, and she worked with Annie Leibovitz and all of these great photographers. So, she's going to bring in a really strong visual dimension. So I feel really good about the movie. It's called Inside Punk. I have a distributor. I have all of the gear that I need to do it correctly. And yeah, that's a shameless plug for the upcoming project, but that's really what we're going to be doing for the next year.
That's fantastic. I saw an interview. I cannot remember which one it was. It wasn't too long ago. But you were talking about that as well. How like the Hollywood scene sort of as far as punk scenes being almost overly documented these days. The Hollywood scene has sort of been glossed over and it's only really mentioned in the New York and other scenes, documentaries.
Which is funny because like the whole West Coast scene and all the way up to Nirvana, sprang out of that. And now there's like punk has had like remarkable staying power. I don't understand why there's all these enclaves of punks who they look and dress just like the old school punks to this day all over the West Coast. So it's going to be interesting. I'm not like I don't really like dwell on the past, and I don't follow punk that closely, except for like working on this movie. But in fact, I was hesitant to get back into it when the distributor asked me to, because I was just like, do I really want to rehash all of this stuff? Do I really want to dig in the past? I'm more like, oh, someone's always looking forward to what's new and what's coming out. But the mastering business keeps me, content as far as that goes. So, I decided to give this a try, and as a result, I've sort of become kind of a spokesperson for the punk world, even though ironically I don't spend that much time in it anymore.
Well, you've certainly made an impact on, what turned into, contemporary punk rock. And
I realized back then there was a dark corner to punk rock, which was that I realized that the major labels were never going to sign it. because they had just been given like just massive tax breaks by Reagan, and and it was sort of with the caveat that you know nobody wanted to see this anarchist music that was coming out of England with the Sex Pistols and the Damned and stuff. We didn't want to see it in America, so they weren't going to sign punk rock anyway.
Right.
And I got wind of it because I had been working in a recording studio just before punk rock hit. Like in 1975, I'd done my first work in a recording studio, and I got tipped off to these scams where people were able to write off, you know, huge records. They could amortize them over 7 years, and so like, it turned into a scam where they would make like, expensive looking records and make a bunch of fake receipts and then write them off. So the heads of these record companies had a very strong disincentive to put out new music. They got traded this sort of like investment scam for having to find new bands. So punk rock got swept under the rug, and I knew that was happening. And so I kind of went at it with a vengeance. I said, nobody's going to do this. So I just have to do what I can and document this. And so like I kind of like, made it my mission that no matter how little I got paid and how difficult the circumstances were and how crappy the studios were, I was just going to record all of this stuff. And as a result, I ended up recording hundreds of records all the way through the late 70s and well into the 90s of basically outsider acts. Now I've started a nonprofit called Hyperactivist, which is devoted to the task of documenting outsider, folk art groups, which is, believe it or not, it's funny to say it because it was so loud, but punk rock is folk music.
Right. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll end this thing. Again, thanks for talking to me. It was a pleasure.
It's been very nice talking to you. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, folks, that wraps up my interview with Geza X. You can find him on most of the usual social medias. Plenty of interesting tidbits out there. Check out his other band, Silver Chalice, for sure. Cool sort of neo-goth 80s thing. And that's it. Take care. Bye.